Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to get into some pretty intense vocabulary.
Yeah, definitely intense.
It's from a high-stakes meeting in the Oval Office. So we're talking about how people in positions of power use language.
To get what they want to negotiate to persuade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe throw in a little shade while they're at it.
Oh, absolutely. You know what's interesting about this conversation is that it's not your typical, diplomatic language.
Yeah.
It's formal, but then it gets informal, too.
Right. Like they're trying to walk this line between being polite and being super assertive.
Yeah, and that comes out in their word choices.
It really does. One thing that jumped out at me was all the phrasal verbs.
Oh, yeah.
Like go through, break down, end up.
It's a phrasal verb party in here.
Seriously.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start by explaining what a phrasal verb even is for anyone who's new to this.
Sure, a phrasal verb, it's basically a verb that's made up of two or more words, usually a verb and a preposition.
Okay.
And the tricky thing is the meaning isn't always obvious just from those individual words.
You go through doesn't literally mean you're walking through a door.
Exactly. Right? Sometimes they have a totally different meaning than the words themselves.
So let's break down a few of the phrasal verbs we found in this transcript, starting with go through.
Okay, sounds good.
It pops up a couple of times. Like when one person says, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me.
Right. In that context, go through means to experience something tough or challenging.
Ah, okay. So going through a difficult time, not like going through your closet.
Yeah, more like facing some serious adversity, overcoming obstacles.
Right. What about breakdown?
Breakdown. Oh, I remember that one. They were talking about a ceasefire breaking down.
Exactly. In that case, breakdown means to fail or to stop working.
Right. Like a machine breaking down, but in this case, it's an agreement that's falling apart.
Yeah. And things could get a lot worse once that happens.
Absolutely. It's a pretty serious situation when a ceasefire breaks down.
And then we have end up, which seems a bit more straightforward.
Yeah, end up is often used to describe a final outcome or result.
So after all the back and forth, this is where we landed.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've tackled some phrasal verbs, but this conversation is also full of idioms, which can be tricky because their meaning isn't always literal.
Yeah, idioms are those expressions that you can't understand just from the individual words.
Right, like they have this hidden meaning that you need to kind of decode.
Exactly. And they often draw on shared cultural experiences or historical references.
So understanding idioms can really give you a deeper understanding of how English speakers think.
Yeah, and how they use language to express themselves.
Okay, so let's dive into a few of the idioms from this transcript. One that stood out to me was, you don't have the cards right now with us?
Having the cards.
Yeah. Are they playing poker in the Oval Office?
Not quite. In this case, having the cards means to have the advantage or to be in a position of power.
Ah, so it's not about actual cards.
Right. It's about having leverage or control in a situation.
Got it. Then there's this line. You're buried there. Your people are dying.
Okay, that one's a bit more intense.
Right. Bury someone sounds pretty aggressive.
It is. It means to completely dominate or defeat someone.
Wow. So they're not literally burying someone.
No. But they're using very strong language to make their point.
Like they're trying to intimidate the other person.
Exactly. It's a power move.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But then there are moments where the language gets surprisingly casual, even a little slangy.
Oh, yeah. For such a formal setting?
I know. We've got tough guy,
Yeah.
scam, and they even use litigate in a way that doesn't seem very legal.
Yeah, it's interesting how they mix those informal elements into this very formal context.
So what's the purpose of using slang in a situation like this?
Well, it can be a way to create a sense of informality or to try to connect with the other person on a more personal level.
Okay.
But it can also be used to express strong emotions or even to undermine the other person.
Like calling someone a tough guy might be a way of saying they're all talk and no action.
Exactly. Or using scam is clearly meant to discredit something or someone.
And then there's litigate, which they're not using in the legal sense.
Yeah. Right. They're using it more broadly to mean arguing or fighting about something publicly.
Which seems almost sarcastic given the setting.
Yeah, like they're implying the other person is being dramatic or trying to make a big deal out of something.
It's amazing how much meaning can be packed into just one word choice.
Absolutely. Word choice can completely change the tone and the message.
Speaking of powerful phrases, there's that line, don't tell us what we're going to feel.
Oh, I love that one. It sounds almost like a proverb.
It does, right?
Yeah, proverbs are those concise expressions of wisdom or commonly held beliefs.
And that particular phrase is a real statement of independence and self-determination.
Yeah, it's like saying, I'm not going to let you control my emotions.
It's about pushing back against being manipulated or controlled.
Exactly. And it ties into this theme we see throughout the conversation about who has the power and who's being pressured to comply.
Right, so it's not just about feelings, it's about the whole power dynamic. This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
But I think we need to shift gears a bit and talk about some of the more advanced vocabulary because this transcript is packed with it.
Yeah, it's like a crash course in political jargon.
Seriously. We've got words like diplomacy, ceasefire, propaganda, manpower.
It's a lot to take in. But these are words that anyone who wants to understand global politics needs to know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's start with diplomacy. It's a word we hear all the time, but what does it really mean?
Diplomacy is basically the art of negotiating between countries.
Like trying to resolve conflicts peacefully.
Exactly. It involves tact communication skills and a deep understanding of international relations.
So it's more than just being polite. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Right. And it's a crucial part of maintaining peace and stability in the world.
Okay, what about ceasefire?
A ceasefire is a temporary agreement to stop fighting.
So it's like hitting the pause button on a war.
Yeah, usually to allow for negotiations or to deliver humanitarian aid.
But it's not necessarily a permanent solution.
Right? Ceasefires can be very fragile, and they often break down if one side violates the terms.
And then there's propaganda, which always sounds a bit sinister to me.
Propaganda is about spreading information that's biased or misleading.
To influence people's opinions.
Exactly. It can be used for good or bad depending on the intentions of the people spreading it.
So it's like a form of persuasion, but not always in an honest way.
Right. It's about manipulating people's beliefs and perceptions.
And then we have manpower, which sounds a bit old-fashioned.
Yeah, it's not the most politically correct term these days.
But it's still used.
It is. And it simply means the number of people available to work or fight.
Okay, so like in a military context, it would refer to the number of soldiers a country has.
Exactly.
All right, we've covered a lot of vocabulary, but I feel like we need to dig into some of the other words that contribute to the tone and the power dynamics of this conversation.
Yeah, those seemingly simple words that actually carry a lot of weight.
Like disrespectful and influence.
Those are good examples. They might not sound complex, but they play a big role in shaping the power dynamics of this exchange.
So let's start with disrespectful. Why is that word so significant in this context?
Well, in this setting, accusing someone of being disrespectful is a way of calling out their behavior.
And putting them on the defensive.
Exactly. It's a way of establishing moral high ground and suggesting that the other person is not playing by the rules.
So it's like a subtle power move?
Yeah, they're not explicitly saying you're wrong, but they're implying it by suggesting the other person is being inappropriate.
And what about influence? It's a pretty common word, but what's its significance here?
In this context, influence is tied to power and leverage. Remember that line, you will feel the influence, but right now you are not in a good position.
Yeah, it's almost like a veiled threat, isn't it?
It is. They're basically saying, I have the power to make things difficult for you if you don't cooperate.
Wow. It's amazing how even seemingly simple words can be used to assert dominance.
Absolutely. Language can be a very powerful tool for controlling a conversation.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in terms of vocabulary, but there's still so much more to unpack about this conversation.
Oh, yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
We need to talk about those cultural and political references like javelins versus sheets, Hunter Biden's laptop, and this whole idea of litigating in the media.
Those references add another layer of complexity to the conversation.
Right. It's like they're speaking in code sometimes.
In a way, they are.
Yeah.
And we need to decode that code if we want to fully understand what's going on.
So buckle up, listeners, because we're about to go even deeper into this fascinating linguistic battle.
I can't wait. Welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about how those cultural and political references really add another layer to this whole conversation.
Yeah, it's like you need a secret decoder ring to understand what they're talking about sometimes.
Right. It's not just about the words themselves, but like the whole context surrounding them.
Exactly. You mentioned javelins versus sheets earlier. Can you give us some background on that?
Sure. So basically, this reference highlights the differences in the military aid that's being provided.
Okay.
Javelins are those like high-tech anti-tank missiles.
Pretty serious weaponry.
Yeah, very powerful. And sheets, well, they're just sheets.
Okay. So the comparison is meant to show like a huge difference in the level of support.
Exactly. It's not about literal sheets, right?
Right.
It's about using them as a symbol for something that's like basic and insufficient.
Compared to those advanced weapons.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
What about the mention of Hunter Biden's laptop? I feel like every time I hear about that, it's in the context of some political controversy.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because it brings in a whole web of political allegations and counter allegations.
Right.
The speaker is bringing it up to discredit their opponent,
To make them look bad.
Yeah, suggest that they're involved in something shady. But they don't really go into the details.
It's like they're dropping a bomb and then walking away.
Yeah, it's a way of shifting the focus of the conversation and putting the other person on the defense without really having to provide any evidence.
Exactly. And then there's this phrase, litigating in the media, which comes up again and again.
It does. They keep going back to that idea that, like, argument should be handled privately, not in the public eye.
Yeah, it shows a frustration with how political disputes are often handled these days.
With everything being so public all the time.
Yeah, it suggests that both sides are more concerned with winning the PR battle than with actually solving problems.
So it's like they're accusing each other of being more interested in looking good than in doing good.
Exactly. It's a way of undermining the other person's motives.
Okay, so beyond these cultural and political references, I'm noticing some interesting power dynamics at play too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like one person keeps interrupting the other, which seems pretty rude.
It is rude, and it's definitely a power move.
Like a way of saying, my voice matters more than yours.
Yeah, it's about dominance.
Yeah.
Controlling the flow of the conversation, preventing the other person from speaking.
Which can be really frustrating if you're on the receiving end of that.
Absolutely. It creates this imbalance where one person is in control and the other person is constantly being shut down.
I also noticed that one speaker uses a lot of flattery and compliments, even when they're delivering some harsh criticisms.
Ah, yes. The classic ingratiation strategy.
Is that what it's called?
It is. It's a pretty common persuasion technique.
So how does it work?
By offering praise or expressing admiration,
Buttering them up.
Exactly. You try to create a sense of goodwill so that the other person is more receptive to your message, even if it's negative.
So it's like, you're a great guy, but you're totally wrong about this.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way of softening the blow and maybe even disarming the other person.
Because who doesn't like to hear nice things about themselves, even if it's coming from someone who's about to disagree with you?
Right.
Speaking of disarming, there are times when one speaker seems to be deliberately provoking the other.
Provocation can be a risky strategy.
It can definitely backfire.
Yeah, but it can also be effective in throwing the other person off balance.
Making them emotional.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to get under the other person's skin and make them lose their cool.
Which could give them an advantage.
Right, because if you can make someone react emotionally, you can sometimes gain control of the situation.
But it's a fine line to walk.
It is. You don't want to push too far, or the whole thing could blow up in your face.
All right, so we've talked about flattery and provocation.
Hmm.
Are there any other persuasion techniques that stand out to you in this conversation?
Um, Let me think. Oh, repetition is a big one.
Oh, yeah.
By repeating certain phrases or ideas.
You make them stick in the listener's mind.
Right. And it also emphasizes their importance. Like one phrase that's repeated several times in this conversation is you don't have the cards.
Yeah, that one really stood out to me too.
It's a way of reinforcing the speaker's power and reminding the other person that they're not in a position to dictate terms.
It's like a subtle way of saying, I'm in control here.
Exactly. Repetition can also be used to create an emotional response. Think about how often we hear phrases like, it's not fair, or this is outrageous.
Yeah, those are definitely attention-grabbing phrases.
Right. And the repetition just amplifies the sense of injustice or anger.
So it's not just about logic, it's about tapping into those emotional triggers.
Exactly. Persuasion is about more than just facts and figures. It's about connecting with people on an emotional level.
And sometimes that means using language to evoke certain feelings.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the specific techniques that are being used, but what about the overall impact? Do you think these strategies are actually effective?
That's a tough question to answer.
Because it depends on the situation.
Yeah, and on the people involved. But
Mhm.
what we can say for sure is that language is a powerful tool.
It can be used to build things up or to tear things down.
Exactly. It can be used to inform, to persuade, to manipulate, to control.
So it's up to us to be aware of how language is being used and to make sure we're not being manipulated.
Right. We need to be critical thinkers and not just take everything we hear at face value.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has been.
I feel like I've learned so much about the hidden power of language and how it can be used to influence, persuade, and even manipulate.
Yeah, and hopefully we've given our listeners some tools to become more aware of these tactics.
Exactly. Because once you know what to look for, you can start to see these things everywhere.
In conversations, in the media, in politics,
Everywhere.
it's all around us.
Okay, so before we jump to conclusions about who won this linguistic battle, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, the cultural and political implications of all this.
What does this conversation tell us about the world beyond this one room?
That's a great question. And that's what we're going to explore in our final segment.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up this whole deep dive into this Oval Office meeting.
Yeah, we've gone through the vocabulary, the power dynamics, all those little persuasion tactics.
But now I think it's time to zoom out a bit.
Hey, look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. What can we learn from this conversation about, the world outside of this room?
Well, one thing that really strikes me is how this meeting, with all its linguistic maneuvering, reflects these bigger cultural and political trends.
Yeah.
We see this clash of ideologies, tensions between national interests, this constant struggle for dominance.
And it's all playing out through these carefully chosen words.
Right. It's like language is the weapon of choice here.
You mentioned earlier that language is never neutral. It's a tool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like any tool, it can be used for different purposes.
Right, like a hammer can build a house or it can break a window.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we become more aware of these different uses of language,
Yeah, how do we avoid being manipulated by all this clever wording?
Well, it starts with being an active listener, not just passively absorbing the words, but actively thinking about what's being said, who's saying it, what their motives are.
So it's like being a detective looking for clues.
Exactly. You have to read between the lines, understand the subtext.
Like you pointed out with that javelins versus sheets comparison, it wasn't just about military aid, it was about highlighting this imbalance of support.
Right. And maybe even expressing some resentment there.
And then there's that phrase, litigating in the media, which shows how frustrated they are with how politics plays out in public these days.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, can't we just argue in private without everyone watching?
But it also shows this tension between transparency and manipulation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the media can be used to inform the public, but it can also be used to spin stories and control the narrative.
So we have to be careful about what we believe.
Yeah, we can't just take everything at face value. We have to think critically about the information we're consuming.
Okay, so what are some practical tips for becoming more discerning consumers of language, both in our personal lives and in the political arena?
We'll first pay attention to the source. Who's speaking? What are their credentials? Do they have any biases we should be aware of?
Right, because the messenger matters just as much as the message.
Exactly. Second, be aware of emotional language. Those words that are designed to trigger a reaction like disrespectful, buried, scam.
Yeah, those words definitely stand out
They're like red flags telling us to be extra critical.
because the speaker might be trying to manipulate our emotions.
Exactly. Third, look for evidence. Don't just accept assertions at face value. Ask for data examples, logical reasoning.
Right, hold them accountable.
Yeah, and finally, be willing to engage in respectful dialogue, even with people who have different views than you.
That's so important, especially these days when everything feels so polarized.
It is. We need to be willing to listen, to understand, to consider different perspectives.
Because that's how we grow and learn.
And that's how we move forward as a society.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey.
It really has.
We've uncovered the hidden power of language, explored the art of persuasion, and gained some valuable insights into how political communication works.
We've dissected this conversation like a linguistic puzzle, revealing all the little pieces that fit together.
And hopefully we've given our listeners the tools to become more aware of these tactics and to approach communication with a more critical eye.
Because language is powerful and we need to use it wisely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, remember listeners, words matter. Use them wisely, use them thoughtfully, and use them to make the world a better place.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those linguistic muscles flexed.